There is a type of person who can leave you exhausted without ever raising their voice. They don't have to insult you. They don't have to threaten you. They don't even have to do anything obviously wrong. You simply spend an hour with them, and somehow you feel different afterward. Heavier, confused, emotionally exhausted. You start questioning yourself, your decisions, your feelings. Sometimes you don't even know why. And this is where most people make a mistake. They assume, if someone drains me, they must be a bad person. But what if that's not true? What if some of the people who drain you aren't evil at all? What if they're carrying something inside themselves that they have never learned how to carry alone? And what if, without realizing it, they are transferring that burden onto you? Carl Jung spent much of his life studying something most people rarely examine: the unconscious world inside human relationships. He understood that people don't simply interact with each other through words. They interact through emotions, fears, unresolved conflicts, hidden needs, and psychological projections. You may think you're having a normal conversation, but beneath the conversation, something else may be happening. One person is anxious. The other absorbs the anxiety. One person is insecure. The other begins defending themselves. One person needs constant reassurance. The other slowly becomes responsible for providing it. And eventually, one person leaves the interaction feeling relieved, while the other feels completely drained. That is the pattern we need to understand, because emotional exhaustion is not always caused by conflict. Sometimes it is caused by emotional imbalance. You are constantly giving while they are constantly taking. You listen, they unload. You understand, they demand understanding. You apologize, they rarely take responsibility. You adjust, they expect you to keep adjusting. And eventually, you begin wondering, why do I feel so exhausted around this person? Pay attention to that question, because sometimes your exhaustion is information. It is your mind telling you something in this relationship is no longer reciprocal. But there is a deeper reason this happens. And this is where Carl Jung's psychology becomes extremely powerful. He believed that human beings often project parts of themselves onto other people. A person who has never confronted their own insecurity may constantly see rejection everywhere. A person who cannot tolerate their own anger may accuse everyone else of being hostile. A person who cannot sit with their own emptiness may constantly demand attention from others. They are not necessarily consciously manipulating you. They may not even understand what they are doing, but the effect on you can still be destructive. And this is the dangerous part. You can have compassion for someone's pain without becoming responsible for carrying it. Those are two completely different things, because some people spend their entire lives trying to rescue wounded people and slowly become wounded themselves. They believe, if I understand them enough, they will change. If I love them enough, they will become healthier. If I stay patient enough, they will eventually appreciate me. But sometimes they don't change. You simply become more exhausted. And there is one psychological pattern that makes this especially dangerous. The more empathetic you are, the easier it can become to confuse understanding someone with being responsible for them. You see their childhood, their trauma, their insecurity, their fear, their loneliness, and because you understand why they behave the way they do, you begin excusing what their behavior is doing to you. That's the trap. Understanding is not the same as permission. Compassion is not the same as access. And someone's pain does not give them unlimited access to your peace. So before you label someone evil, ask a different question. What happens to me when I am around them? Do you constantly feel guilty? Do you feel responsible for their emotions? Do you become afraid to say no? Do you rehearse conversations because you're worried about their reaction? Do you feel exhausted after trying to make them happy? Do you find yourself becoming smaller just to keep the relationship peaceful? If the answer is yes, something important is happening. And in the next part, we're going to examine the most dangerous type of emotional drain, the person who doesn't simply take your energy, but slowly teaches you to distrust your own perception. That is where the relationship stops being merely exhausting and becomes psychologically dangerous. There is something more dangerous than being around a difficult person. It is being around someone who slowly changes the way you see yourself. At first, you may not even notice it. You simply start questioning your reactions. You wonder, am I being too sensitive? Did I misunderstand them? Maybe I'm making a big deal out of this. Maybe I should just let it go. And every time you question yourself, they gain a little more influence over you. This is where emotional exhaustion can become psychological dependence, because now you are no longer simply managing their emotions. You are managing your own perception of what is happening. And that can become incredibly draining. Think about a relationship where every disagreement somehow becomes your fault. You explain how something made you feel. They don't address what you said. Instead, they explain why you shouldn't feel that way. You bring up their behavior. They remind you of something you did months ago. You ask for a boundary. They call you selfish. You become hurt. They become the victim. And somehow you end up apologizing. Again, this pattern can be extremely confusing because there may be no obvious villain. There may be no dramatic confrontation, just a constant shift where you are slowly trained to doubt your own emotional reality. And this is where Carl Jung's idea of projection becomes important. Projection happens when people unconsciously place aspects of themselves onto someone else. They may experience anger, but see you as angry. They may feel insecurity, but constantly accuse you of being insecure. They may fear abandonment, but accuse you of being distant. They may feel inadequate, but constantly criticize your shortcomings. The person may genuinely believe their interpretation. That's what makes projection so powerful. They don't always know they're doing it. And because they believe their own story, they can make you question yours. But there is another psychological mechanism that makes emotionally draining relationships even more difficult. You begin adapting. You stop saying certain things. You choose your words carefully. You monitor their mood. You avoid certain subjects. You change your behavior before they even react. Eventually, you aren't simply having a relationship with them. You are managing their emotional environment, and that is exhausting. Because you can never fully relax. You're always watching, always predicting, always adjusting, always asking yourself, how will they react? And slowly, something happens. You lose spontaneity, you lose confidence, you lose the ability to simply be yourself. You become a psychological caretaker. And the more you do it, the more normal it feels. This is why some people remain in draining relationships for years, not because they enjoy suffering, because the pattern becomes familiar, and the human mind often confuses familiarity with safety. If you grew up learning that love meant managing someone else's emotions, you may unconsciously repeat that pattern later. You may become attracted to people who need rescuing, people who are emotionally unpredictable, people who constantly need reassurance, people who make you work for their approval, and you may call it chemistry. But sometimes, what feels like chemistry is simply familiarity. Your nervous system recognizes the pattern, not because the pattern is healthy, because you've experienced it before. And this is where you need to be extremely careful, because empathy can become a trap when it has no boundaries. You can understand someone's pain and still walk away. You can understand their childhood and still say no. You can understand their insecurity without becoming their emotional regulator. You can forgive someone without giving them unlimited access to you. That distinction can change your entire life, because the goal is not to identify evil people. The goal is to recognize unhealthy dynamics before they consume you. And sometimes, the person draining you is not trying to destroy you. They are simply trying to get from you what they have never learned to provide for themselves. Constant reassurance, attention, validation, emotional regulation, security, identity, and if you keep providing all of it, they never have to develop it themselves. You become their emotional infrastructure, and they become increasingly dependent on you. That may feel like being needed, but being needed is not the same as being loved, and this leads to the final question. What do you do when you finally realize that the person draining you may never change? Because this is where most people make their biggest mistake. They try harder. They explain more. They become more patient. They give another chance, then another, and another. But there comes a moment when the most compassionate thing you can do is stop participating in the pattern. And in the final part, we'll explore how to protect your energy without becoming cold, how to create boundaries without guilt, and how to recognize the moment when compassion has quietly turned into self-abandonment. There comes a moment when you finally have to ask yourself a question you may have been avoiding for years. How much of myself am I willing to lose just to keep this person in my life? Because there is a difference between helping someone and slowly disappearing for them. You can love someone and still need distance. You can understand someone and still say no. You can forgive someone and still refuse to give them the same access to you. This is one of the hardest lessons for deeply empathetic people to learn. Your compassion does not require your self-destruction, and your understanding does not create an obligation to remain in an unhealthy relationship. Carl Jung understood that psychological growth requires becoming conscious of the patterns that control us. And sometimes the pattern is not simply, why does this person drain me? The deeper question is, why do I keep allowing myself to be drained? That question changes everything, because once you stop focusing entirely on the other person's behavior, you can finally examine your own. Why do you keep saying yes when you desperately want to say no? Why do you keep explaining yourself to someone who has already decided not to understand? Why do you keep rescuing people who never take responsibility for themselves? Why do you keep confusing being needed with being loved? And why does setting a simple boundary make you feel guilty? The answer may not be that you are weak. It may be that somewhere along the way, you learned that keeping other people comfortable was safer than being honest about what you needed. So you became adaptable. You became understanding. You became forgiving. You became endlessly patient. And eventually, you forgot something incredibly important. You are also a person whose needs matter. A boundary is not punishment. A boundary is information. It says, this is what I will accept, and this is what I will not accept. You don't need to shout. You don't need to threaten. You don't need to explain for 20 minutes. Sometimes, The most powerful boundary is simply a calm no, and watch what happens next. Healthy people may not always like your boundary, but they can respect it. Unhealthy dynamics often react differently. Suddenly you are selfish, cold, difficult, unreasonable. After everything they've done for you, how could you possibly say no? Pay attention to that reaction, because sometimes, the moment you establish a boundary, you discover exactly what the relationship was built on. If the relationship survives only when you have no boundaries, then the relationship was never truly reciprocal. It was dependent on your compliance. And this is where you must become honest with yourself. You cannot heal someone who refuses to examine themselves. You cannot regulate another person's emotions for the rest of your life. You cannot love someone into becoming emotionally mature. And you cannot sacrifice your peace without eventually paying a psychological price. Sometimes that price is anxiety, sometimes resentment, sometimes emotional numbness, and sometimes you wake up one day and realize you don't even recognize yourself anymore. That is the real danger. Not the difficult person, not the manipulator, not even the emotionally wounded person. The real danger is losing yourself while trying to save someone else. Carl Jung believed that psychological growth requires integrating the parts of yourself you have rejected, and one of those rejected parts may be the part of you that knows when enough is enough, the part that is angry, the part that says, "This hurts," the part that says, "I don't want this anymore," the part that finally understands, "I am allowed to leave." You don't have to destroy your compassion to protect that part of yourself. You simply have to stop using compassion as an excuse to abandon yourself. And perhaps this is the most important distinction in the entire video. Being kind does not mean being endlessly available. Being empathetic does not mean absorbing everyone else's emotions. Being forgiving does not mean repeating the same mistake forever. And loving someone does not mean giving them unlimited access to your mind, your time, your energy, and your peace. Some people will only respect your boundary after they realize you are actually willing to enforce it. That is not cruelty. That is self-respect. And something else may happen when you finally stop participating in unhealthy dynamics. You may feel guilty. Don't automatically interpret that guilt as proof that you are doing something wrong. Sometimes guilt is simply the emotional residue of an old identity, the identity that always kept the peace, always helped, always apologized, always stayed, always gave another chance. You are not necessarily becoming selfish. You may simply be becoming unfamiliar with abandoning yourself, and that unfamiliarity can feel uncomfortable at first. Let it. Growth often feels uncomfortable before it feels natural. You don't need to become cold. You don't need to distrust everyone. You don't need to stop loving people. You simply need to become more conscious of where your responsibility ends and someone else's begins. Their emotions belong to them. Their choices belong to them. Their healing belongs to them. And your life belongs to you. So the next time someone leaves you feeling completely drained, don't immediately ask, "What's wrong with them?" Ask, "What is happening inside me when I am around them?" Do you feel smaller? Do you feel anxious? Do you feel responsible? Do you feel afraid to speak? Do you feel like you have to earn peace? Listen carefully. Your body may recognize a pattern before your conscious mind is ready to admit it. And if you discover that a relationship is consistently destroying your peace, you are allowed to step back. You are allowed to create distance. You are allowed to say no. You are allowed to leave. without turning the other person into a monster, because perhaps they aren't evil. Perhaps they are wounded. Perhaps they are unconscious. Perhaps they have never learned how to carry their own pain. But understanding that doesn't mean you have to carry it for them. And that is the lesson. You can have compassion without becoming someone's container. You can love people without losing yourself. You can understand their darkness without allowing it to become yours. Because the strongest form of compassion is not sacrificing yourself so someone else never has to change. It is understanding where your responsibility ends and where theirs begins. So if there is someone in your life who constantly leaves you emotionally exhausted, don't ask yourself only, are they a bad person? Ask something deeper. Who am I becoming by staying in this dynamic? Because sometimes the person draining you is not the greatest danger. The greatest danger is the version of yourself you become when you keep accepting what your soul has already told you is too much. You were not put on this earth to regulate everyone else's emotions. You were not born to constantly prove your loyalty through suffering. And you do not have to destroy your own peace to prove that you care. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can say is nothing. You simply step back. You stop explaining. You stop rescuing. You stop chasing. And you allow people to experience the consequences of their own choices. That is not abandonment. That is reality. And perhaps this is what Carl Jung was pointing toward when he spoke about becoming conscious. You cannot control every person who enters your life, but you can become conscious of who you give access to. You can become conscious of what you tolerate. You can become conscious of the patterns you repeat. And once you become conscious, you finally have a choice. So remember this. Not everyone who drains you is evil. Some are simply wounded. Some are unconscious. Some are deeply dependent. Some have never learned how to regulate themselves. But their pain does not become your responsibility simply because you understand it. You can wish them healing without sacrificing your own. You can love them without staying close to them. And you can walk away without hatred, because protecting your peace doesn't make you heartless. It means you finally understand that your life is yours to protect. And the moment you stop abandoning yourself just to keep someone else comfortable, something changes. You become quieter, clearer, stronger, not because you learned how to control other people, but because you finally learned how to control your own access. And that is a kind of freedom no one can take from you.